Hello, my name's Kate Fitzpatrick and I'm a programmer at the Melbourne International Film Festival. I'm coming to you today from the Forum Theatre, which stands on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present. I'm talking today with the co-directors of the wonderful film River, Jennifer Peedom and Joseph Nizeti. Hi, Jennifer, Joseph.
Hi, Kate.
Hi,
Hi,
thanks, Kate.
everyone.
Firstly, congratulations on a truly wonderful film. I'm interested to know how the two of you came to collaborate on this together as co-directors.
Um, well, actually, it began a long time ago, many years ago. Sort of prequel to River was a film called Mountain, which also played at Melbourne a few years ago. And Joseph was working for the Australian Chamber Orchestra, managing all of their what we call audio-visual projects. So we worked together in a very different capacity on Mountain. And then when we were working, when we were doing the festival tour, actually, I spent more time with Joseph, and I realized that he had a real knack for story, which is obviously something really important in the filmmaking game. And so he came and started consulting on other little projects with us. And the conversation about making a sequel to Mountain came up, and it just sort of was a really natural fit that Joseph would work with us in some way on that project, given his experience on having worked on Mountain on the music side, but had also done a whole lot of research with us. And he and I were starting to work on the writing side of the film, and so Joseph just came on board, and it was a natural kind of progression for him to become a co-director on the film, because his contribution was so invaluable.
Great. I heard you speaking earlier about this unique approach to making this film, in that all of the elements were thought of from the outset. So I'm interested to hear, can you talk a bit more about that process?
These projects are unusual because they begin with the music in a way. So Mountain, its predecessor, River's predecessor, was actually commissioned by the Australian Chamber Orchestra. So deep in its DNA, it was always going to be a live concert. And at a certain point in that process, we decided, well, I'm not a video artist, I'm a filmmaker. So we decided to make a film, and then the way that funding works, it necessitated us actually just making a movie as well as this live performance thing. And it became one and the same thing. So when we started to talk about River, it was always, I think, part of the heart and soul of a project like this is the live performance aspect of it. And so that does really change the way that you're going to work on a normal film, because it's this kind of, story always comes first, but in a film like this, you need to always think about the live performance aspect of it. And Joseph, you should speak to this whole idea of working with classical music and how it is really difficult to cut. You can't just fade out Beethoven, for example.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it was interesting collaborating with Jen and Richard Tognetti, the artistic director of the Australian Chamber Orchestra, on Mountain. Very, very much a key part of my role on that film ended up being sort of sitting between the sort of film side, the editing side, and then the music side, and getting that to work at the level of sort of music editing and connecting that to the film and the intention behind each of the scenes. And I mean, with this project, the creative reason for the music in there, if you see it, it's this big cocktail of words, music, imagery, those three streams coming together. And it's a very heightened experience of nature, in this case, of rivers around the world. And so the place of music is much larger in one sense than it might be on a typical documentary film, at least. And yeah, navigating the sort of artistic priorities of the musicians who, of course, really want to protect the repertoire that's brought to the film, especially if it is Beethoven or a Bach. And then also really knowing how to respect and follow the lead of the story and each of the scenes in the story and the line through those scenes to kind of take us on this bigger journey through time with humans and rivers.
Because the music is so impeccably paired with the images in the film. Is it a case of the music first and the image later, or is that a fluid kind of process?
I mean, some cases definitely. In some cases, we chose repertoire, and we just had a really strong sense right from the beginning. This piece of repertoire or this piece of music was going to fit, and it kind of always ended up being that way. In other cases, we chose things, and Richard had different ideas. But what is always the case in a project like this is, you know, we edit, and we had an amazing editor on this film, Simon Yo, who, you know, just edited so beautifully to that music that in some cases, you know, maybe if the piece of music isn't that familiar to people, it might feel like it was written for the movie, because it's been so well crafted. But and in some cases the music was in this film about 50-50. But for example, the Ravel, which is in that cloud sequence, for example, that was it's a real crafting, a real edit job, and also a bit of music editing to make that work, because that whole piece, for example, is, I don't know how many minutes long, 8 minutes or something. And I think in our sequence, it's probably about 3 or 4 minutes. So it's a kind of real ebb and flow, and it's a negotiation to some extent, because you can't cut the guts out of, or the heart and soul out of that piece of music, because you need to remember it's also going to be played live on a stage with an orchestra in River Live. And so the orchestra can't chop up these amazing works. And then in other cases, we would do what I would normally do when directing a film, which is I would put temp music that kind of expressed the idea that we were going for, the musical idea or the emotional idea, actually. And then Richard and in this case we had actually 3 composers, Piers Burbrooke de Vere, Richard Tongedi obviously, and then the wonderful William Barton. And so we worked in a different way with all 3 of those composers. So and then there was the music, Johnny Greenwood's Water, this amazing piece of music that you hear a few times throughout the film, and then also William Barton's beautiful piece at the end, and with each of those we worked in different ways.
There's a bit in the behind the scenes video where you talk about the piece of music, the bark piece of music, which is played over the beginning of the river. It's such an emotional part. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about that.
The 2 key characters we follow through the film are humans and rivers. It's this sort of journey through time across eons, you know, and our journey as a species with rivers. And it was really important to us that both humans and rivers themselves had a very powerful introduction at the start of the film. And the particular sequence you're mentioning there, which is accompanied by Bach's Chaconne, originally written for solo violin, is the birth of rivers. So you have this sequence where you see the glaciers on high begin to melt and a single drop flows, and then you finally get this incredible sequence of this river tearing down a hill. And what Richard Tongedi did was take this piece of music that was originally written just for a single solo violinist and sort of explode it out into this piece, this arrangement for the Australian Chamber Orchestra. And it's amazing, the sort of just incredible colours and textures and dimension that he was able to bring to the piece. And it gives it this incredibly cinematic sweep as well. It really just brings the camera movement to life, and it brings just the awakening, the feeling of coming to life that you get in that sequence. The footage it's paired with is absolutely amazing as well. We ended up collaborating with this incredible FPV drone operator named Ralph Hogenberg, who lives in Norway, and that's actually a glacier in Norway that you just dive down in that sort of one continuous take. I think it's around 60 or 70 seconds long. And I mean, what Richard did there, combining the end of the bark with that moment, is just incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's such a visceral experience watching these incredible visuals with the music that goes with it, to the point where when you get to the part of the film where the river kind of breaks free from the catchment, it's a really emotional part of the film. You're kind of really championing the river running free again.
Willing it, aren't you? You're willing
Yeah,
it
exactly.
to the ocean again after being so abused, if you like. And that's always the intention. And I have to say, it's really hard, in films like this where you don't have any human characters that you can't get to know and be rooting for. So you really need to be rooting for the river. You need to be caring about it. And if we've done our jobs right, you will feel emotional when you get to the end of that story. And we hopefully have made you care enough to really want the river to survive and to understand why it is so important that it does function in the way that it should. And perhaps some of the mistakes that we're making in inhibiting it in the way that we have come to do in our development as a species. But I love that bit. And look, again, speaking about the music, that Radiohead track there, just the one blanking, what's it called again?
Oh, it's called In Memoriam, Harry Patch.
The Harry Patch, yeah, which is actually about the last World War One veteran in the UK to die. It was a song for him, and it's so emotional and it's so beautiful. And they're some of my favourite scenes in the film, actually, and a lot of that was shot in Australia, in around Lake Eyre and in Central Australia, where the water is coming back after those big rainfalls, and yeah, they're beautiful, the scenes of the water returning.
The film is so beautiful to look at. Like, there are certain shots that look like works of art. But I understand you ran into some pandemic-related stymieing on your own, but you've managed to collaborate with other people. Could you talk a bit about that?
We actually, our first week in production on this project was the beginning of the last lockdown. So it really affected the way that we made it. But, there's something about creative barriers and obstacles that somehow just forces you to find another way. And I'm so proud of the way that situation forced us to do things, and it really did contribute to the film being the way that it is. Who knows how it would have been otherwise, because we had intended to shoot a lot more, but it meant that we needed to direct by proxy. On Mountain, we'd collaborated with some of my previous collaborators, cinematographers, and there was a group of them in America and in Canada. On this project, we had to reach out far wider, and Joseph, you're probably better to speak to some of the individuals that we went to, but we basically we knew their work, we knew what they were capable of, we knew a lot of them were in lockdown too, so people couldn't get on planes, so we were very specifically finding people in certain regions to get certain things like dams or underwater, and essentially commissioning them to do that by proxy. And obviously I couldn't be there, and we didn't need to be there. We just trusted what they could do. They all knew Mountain, which is lovely. That whole kind of community of nature cinematographers know that film. So we kind of had a entree into that world, and people were excited to be involved. And these guys were so generous in the way that they would just go out there, not knowing if we were going to use it or not necessarily, but really committing to and doing beautiful work, and then sending it back to us to play with in the edit.
Yeah, and Jen's totally right in saying that, there's just no way to know how it would have turned out otherwise, I suppose, if we had made it in March 2019 rather than March 2020. It was very much a case of, we as we were writing the film, we could feel this happening. We could feel that everything was shutting down, that the likelihood of us being able to produce it and shoot it in the way that we'd intended, wasn't going to be able to move ahead. And fortunately, having Mountain was a real asset, not just because we could point to the film and people either had heard of it or, really responded when they saw it, but that there's a whole network of people through Renan Ozturk, the principal cinematographer on Mountain, that we could sort of start this search with, who has shot rivers, who are the river people who are out there who have, really documented rivers in ways that are really visually interesting. And so we were able to start thinking straight away about how are we actually going to characterize rivers. And in writing the film, what aspects of the story are we going to, really try and figure out interesting ways to tell visually. But one example of that is sediment transport with rivers, which, on one level is a very kind of, it's an earth science sort of fact that rivers do transport sediment, which carries, nutrients downstream. And it's, something about rivers that you might learn when you're a child, for instance. But we really knew in the case of this film that it couldn't merely just be a fact. It had to be something that you really felt, that something that wild rivers do in the setup of the film is they carry these incredible sediments everywhere. And then once we begin to dam those rivers, that process ceases, to the detriment of not just the environment and the natural world, but to the humans downstream. And then you're able to get the release of that at the end. So we needed to know that we could actually visualize that on screen, and nothing existed that really captured that in the way that we wanted to. So we ended up reaching out to these incredible cinematographers who we knew had the right gear in northwestern United States to shoot it. So they used these incredible wide-angle lenses and these amazing high-speed cameras that they could actually submerge underwater. And they're some of my favorite shots in the film. They're in that Radiohead Harry Patch sequence, and the dam comes down, and you just drift underwater, and you can see these particles, this sort of life shimmering in the air and moving past. So, it was just this process of, how do we tell this global story about rivers? And then how do we tell these really particular aspects of, its characterization that we want to shed light on, build conflict around, and then, ultimately it's sort of released towards the end of the film.
The other cinematographer who was a discovery was Jan Arthus Bertrand, the French cinematographer / amazing filmmaker, and he as well was very generous with his mainly aerial cinematography of people working, and there's amazing shots of where just paddy rice fields go for miles in places like Tibet. And they really helped tell that part of the story that spoke to agriculture, and the importance in rivers in our survival in that sense.
Yeah, it's quite a political film too, where you talk about it becomes a class thing. The poorer people are the ones that end up paying the price for the pollution of the rivers more than anybody. One thing I'm quite interested in, I mean, you're obviously an environmentalist, it's an area of interest to you. How do you reconcile making a film that is a call to arms about the environment when filmmaking itself has quite a detrimental effect on the environment?
Well, in this case, I mean, we weren't clocking up air miles at all. In fact, I'd say it was a very green film in the sense that none of us got in planes, and still haven't gotten on a plane even to come to Melbourne for the Melbourne Film Festival. So we're doing pretty well in that regard. But normally, you're right, you're flying all over the place. So, look, I mean, my approach with environmentalism and in my filmmaking, and it's been a theme running through a lot of my work, right from Sherpa as well, that I don't want to bang people over the head with it, but I think what you want is for people to arrive there themselves and to come out of the film saying, wow, that was really an environmental film. Or in the case of Sherpa, people said to me, oh, that was a climate change film, wasn't it? And it was, and it had been a lot more heavy-handed at certain points in the edit, but always just kind of wound it back because, the audience, I think it's important to always respect the audience's intelligence and what they will bring to it. I mean, this film was probably the most urgent environmental film that I had been involved in. And, when we were planning it with our wonderful writing collaborator, Robert McFarlane, who is a huge environmentalist and all of his books really focus around, landscape and the human heart and environmentalism and is very concerned about the Anthropocene. He said this has to be more urgent than mountain. And in many ways, rivers are far more vulnerable to our harm than mountains are. I think the main concern with mountains is the snow on them and the glaciers, but the glaciers really are rivers of ice. And, one of the things that he said as we're making it is that it did really feel like it was becoming more urgent as we were making it, because look, the writing process and the development process was a good year or so before we, started making it, and right up to the edit. And, a part of the world that I'm very fond of, and I'm an ambassador of the Australian Himalayan Foundation, is the Himalayas, and the massive infrastructure projects that are going on and that are in the works and being planned up in that part of the world are pretty terrifying. Just diverting those rivers and their flows, to India and China, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, and projects that make the Three Gorges Dam look pretty tiny. And that's the dam in the film that we say slows the rotation of the Earth.
That's astounding. Well, it's certainly a very timely and urgent film, and particularly when people are all stuck at home and being very insular, it's good to be reminded of the world at large and our effect on it. And I love that it has a real message of hope as well, that we can get back on track and that they can repair themselves. And I think that's all we have time for. But thank you so much for talking to me today. And again, congratulations on a really, truly wonderful film.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone for coming.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.